now that we have an understanding of what a primate is and some of the characteristics that we all share, before we get into looking at human evolution, I thought it would be useful for us to just briefly cover some of the highlights of primate evolution to explain a little bit of how did we go from kind of generalized mammalian traits into the special package of traits that are distinct and unique to primates as a group of animals. The fossil record is what we need to rely on to look at this, and the earliest fossil record for primates is expected to become, or is suspected to be apparent somewhere in the Paleocene, but actually identifying who the earliest primate is a little bit problematic, right? Because we see that, again, some of the characteristics that we have as primates, some of the traits that we have are shared with other mammals. It's not until the Eocene that the picture really becomes clear and we start to get some fossils that are truly representative of primates as we understand them today. So that's what I wanted to focus on in this introductory course. In terms of the emergence of primates and what primates look like during the Eocene, so between 55 and 34 million years ago, we have two major groups, the adapoids and the amamioids. And I apologize because, as you can tell, even I struggle with these different terms. So the primates are the primates that we suspect were primates, the organisms that we suspect were primates that predate these Eocene ones. Again, have characteristics that some are indicative of being a primate and others are just more of those of being general mammalian traits themselves. And these primates are considered to be the true primates, right? And they're very successful groups and they have some key characteristics, and this is what I wanted to go over. So the adapoids and the amamioids are also kind of understood as representing our two major groups of primates, right? The strepsirrhines and the haplorhines. So the adapoids are argued to be the earliest ancestors, or at least ancestral to lemurs, lorises, and galagos. Again, we see generalized dentition with them. You can see, again, still have quite a bit of a pronounced snout, right? So remember, those olfactory senses are still very important for strepsirrhines and therefore their ancestors, the adapoids. They're relatively large in body size as early primates go, but again, compared to later primates, to living primates, definitely still fairly small. Their locomotory patterns, so this is where we see that the locomotory patterns of being vertical clingers and leapers and arboreal quadrupeds or slow climbers comes from the strepsirrhines comes from their adapoid heritage, and they had largely a fruit and leaf diet. Now, amamioids, on the other hand, are argued to be ancestral to tarsiers, monkeys, apes, and humans, therefore the haplorhines. And again, we can see that they have the reduced snout, those massive eyes that we saw in the fossil casts as well, or in the replica casts rather. Variable dentition, relatively small bodied, so smaller bodied than the adapoids are. So again, the adapoids, again, very familiar to and closer in size to the lemuriforms. Amamioids are much closer to kind of tarsiers in terms of their overall body size than, again, to apes or chimpanzees. Most forms are still arboreal, as you can see represented here. It's a very similar diet of insects and fruit. But one of the key distinctions between the adapoids and the amamioids is that the adapoids are largely considered to have been diurnal, and this is likely because of their small eyes, whereas amamioids have that nocturnal adaptation. Okay. Once we get into the Oligocene and the late Eocene as well, we start to get into what we call the higher primates, right? And so these are the primates, monkeys, apes, and humans, right? So amamioids and adaptoids are very clearly much more closely related to, again, the strepsirrhines, and then with the amamioids, very much so look like tarsiers, right, or are much more similar to that. But what brought about then the evolution of the higher primates of monkeys, apes, and humans themselves? And that's what we see in this phase with things like Parapithecidae and Proleopithecidae, really good examples of early monkeys and apes potentially as well. The earliest of these higher primates do appear to be things like Apodium, again, a very with a kind of a generic monkey sort of form. And then apes appear a little bit later. And note that both these early monkeys and apes are much more generalized than what we see, right? So we just don't see the wide range of, again, endless forms. Most beautiful because it took time to get to the variety of forms and to develop the various adaptations that we see in the living primates today. So briefly, we'll go over each of these. So Apodium is a small monkey-like quadruped, right? It uses all four limbs to move. And it was largely arboreal, like the others. In terms of dental formula, it has, again, that kind of classic ancestral form of having three premolars, eating mostly fruits and seeds, and it's argued to have been diurnal as well. Egyptopithecus, on the other hand, was larger than Apodium. They're thought to be a lot more akin to some of the larger monkeys, such as howler monkeys. Again, still eating arboreal resources, fruits and leaves, diurnal adaptation. However, its dental formula is that which is shared by apes and humans, where it only has the two premolars. So while we don't see a lot of variety in the earliest primates, once we get to the Miocene, we start to see a bit more of kind of an explosion, as it were. We start to see a bit more diversity in terms of these forms. And they start to look a lot more similar to the living primates, particularly monkeys and apes that we see today. In the early Miocene period, we see a lot of these so-called proto-apes that are very similar are much more similar to the living apes that we see to this day. And the reason why we kind of refer to the Miocene as being a period of explosion of apes and monkeys is because this is where we start to see a clear divergence in the form of apes versus monkeys themselves, and numerous forms of apes appeared. Now, I'm not going to talk about the monkeys because their fossil record is a lot more sparse and limited, but we can talk about the apes themselves. So for the early Miocene, most of the fossils found are described as, again, proto-apes, and the majority of them do come from Africa. The best known genus is that which is represented here, Proconsul, dating between 20 and 18 million years ago. It lacks a tail, which is definitely a characteristic that we know many apes have today, or most apes, or all apes have today. It still was adapted for moving through the trees. It has this quadrupedal locomotion. And based on dental morphology, they're kind of, again, still following that similar plant and fruit eating pattern that we see. Until recently, it was thought to be the last common ancestor of the great apes and of hominins themselves. But there's a few new other fossil specimens that are kind of leading in contention for that role. But Proconsul is definitely the best known due to the relative abundance of fossil specimens and also just because of the clear anatomical markers it has that links it with the apes. In the middle Miocene, we get some really interesting apes that appear in the record. So between 23 and 5 million years ago, and critically around it seems to be 17 million years ago, we see a large number of distinct ape species appearing. And part of this is largely driven to climate change. Earth got a lot warmer at this time period. And we also then see an expanded range that we start to find apes as well, distributing not only throughout Africa, but parts of Europe and Asia as well. And two of the most famous and well-known ones are Kenyapithecus and Gigantopithecus. Kenyapithecus is very similar to Proconsul, sharing many features, but what we see is kind of, again, these kind of incremental changes now where the face looks and teeth, dentition overall look a lot more like contemporary or modern apes. It has very thick enamel teeth and robust jaws that suggests a shift away from kind of fruits and leaves, kind of soft and fibrous foods into harder foods. And it's also thought to have been, to signal a shift away from living dominantly in an arboreal environment into the terrestrial environment. And the limb fossils in particular suggest that they are using a form of knuckle walking, again, a pattern that we see in the living apes today. Gigantopithecus, on the other hand, is a very compelling figure. As you can see, it's called because the fossils are gigantic, and it's clearly the largest primate to have ever lived. It's been thought that they would have weighed up to 660 pounds, which is at least 150 pounds heavier than the largest gorillas that we're aware of. And interestingly, it has some connections with oral histories and potentially some of the cryptid discussions and discourses that are out there. Most students, when they see, and most people, when they see images of Gigantopithecus, think immediately of Sasquatch or Yeti. And so some have suggested that potentially Gigantopithecus could have persisted up until 5 million years ago, where it could have potentially come into contact with early hominins, and somehow that ancestral memory of these forms led to these myths around great apes, or these giant apes or ape-like men of the forest. However, gorillas themselves are quite large, right? Orangutans are also large as well. So potentially it could have just been simply that the wild men of the forest that are being documented, because of their bipedal form, was more likely one of the apes, the great apes themselves, than one of these Miocene anthropoids such as Gigantopithecus. Like Gigantopithecus, they had very thick enamel teeth, as I mentioned here, and large jaws that were adapted for eating very hard, rough foods, so and nuts and leaves, or nuts and seeds. So what we're seeing again is not only the Miocene is an adaptation to a terrestrial environment, but also to terrestrial food resources, which makes a lot of sense, and this is largely through the dentition. What helps as well, and why a lot of our interpretations of this earliest primate fossil record seems to be focused on teeth, is that teeth preserve incredibly well, especially relative to other bones. So a lot of our fossil record does have dentition in some degree or another, and fortunately there's a lot we can interpret about the environment these animals lived in on the basis of their teeth alone. And we'll see this again when we look at hominins in our final topic for this course. From the end of the Middle Miocene into late Miocene, we just see increased diversification. So I think that's the key, right, is that what we have is kind of, in the earliest fossil record relating to primates, very few species represented. It might be just part of the bias of the fossil record itself that simply individuals were not being preserved in a context in which where they were fossilized and then we could see their remains. Simply 55 million years is a long time. However, the evidence does seem to suggest, however, that over time we see greater and greater diversification of form, likely as these primates were moving into different parts of the world and encountering different environments that they needed to adapt to. And again, what we've seen is that this kind of with living primates is that this behavioral plasticity that primates have, the ability to adapt to new environments from a behavioral standpoint, makes sense for microevolution, then that we would start to see changes within populations, then contributing to long-term, over the millions of years that the fossil records demonstrates, into new species forms. So we do see a great diversification of primates over time into the late Miocene. Some of the more famous homininoids at this time, so ape-like early ape fossils we see are Cevapithecus and Dryopithecus. Cevapithecus is also known for its very thick enamel teeth, and it's actually remarkably similar in terms of its other facial traits to modern orangutans. So it's been argued that potentially they represent one of the direct ancestors to living orangs. Dryopithecus, on the other hand, has much thinner dental enamel, lighter jaws, and it looks a lot more like contemporary African apes, so chimpanzees and gorillas. However, things get very complicated whenever we're looking at connection between fossil or ancestral forms and living forms today. What then happens around this late Miocene period is that apes start to kind of disappear, as it were, from the fossil record, with the exception of Gigantopithecus, which, as I mentioned, persists well into about 5 million years ago or is now. So basically, this fossil record isn't as strong as what we see in the Middle Miocene period, where we see this veritable explosion. And it's been argued that this is actually directly the result of climate change at this time, where we see a shift from a very wet and hot and therefore humid environment into a colder, drier period. And this would have reduced the extent of forest and therefore impacted primates. And remember that other primate forms were persisting at this time. I'm just highlighting some of the key ones that seem to be ancestral to some of our living forms. But and as I mentioned, that it's not that monkeys did not exist at this time. They must have, but their fossil record is relatively poor, and this likely relates to the production of forests in the Miocene period, in the late Miocene. Also likely reflects just that forests aren't the best preservation environments, especially hot, humid forests, for organic materials, including bone. And this is why we might simply just have a preservation bias that's impacting our ability to understand this earliest record. Okay, So we're going to take a look at hopefully some of these casts, and we can talk about some of these images in class. And then next week, we're going to make a connection between this and then what happens when we get into the earliest potential candidates for not just our species, but for our ancestral species as well.